Who's to blame for the post office scandal? Why are so many children missing school? And should high earners pay more tax? This is Politics Live. Joining me in the studio, Conservative MP Heather Wheeler, Labour's Shadow Schools Minister Catherine McKinnell, SNP MP Richard Thompson and the former Conservative advisor Salma Shah. Today, as victims of the post office scandal are promised justice, we'll ask who's to blame for the whole affair.
We were classed as criminals by the post office. Now it's their turn to actually be investigated.
Record numbers of pupils are missing school. How can we get them back into the classroom?
It's 1 in 5 children who are persistently absent from school, and that number is set to rise to 1 in 4. That is a staggering number of children, and it's damaging their life chances.
We'll hear from a primary school head teacher about this growing problem. And what's the right rate of tax? Governments in Westminster and Edinburgh have very different views.
I was always clear that my plan was to halve inflation and then start cutting taxes to help people with their financial security, and that's what we've delivered.
When public services need investment and protection from Tory cuts, this government does believe that those with the broadest shoulders should pay a higher rate of tax.
Let's start with that scandal, the post office. We talked about it at some length yesterday, but it makes a lot of the front pages, unsurprisingly, today, as the government tries to find out ways of how they can speed up the process of appeals and compensation following that ITV drama. The Daily Mail has this: shameless as national revulsion over post office scandal mounts. Former boss still clings to her CBE, that's Paula Vennells there on the left, and the Lib Dem leader refuses to step aside. If we roll on to The Guardian, the scramble to clear victims of post office fraud scandal. The Daily Express: why are police failing to deliver on post office scandal? And finally, in The Times, fast appeals for wrongly convicted postmasters. So all the papers have a different focus on who they blame for what has gone wrong over decades. Many of the papers also criticise Fujitsu, the company behind the Horizon IT system that was installed and was at the heart of what went wrong for sub-postmasters and mistresses. So my opening question to all of you, with the politicians, the police, the post office, Paula Vennells, who do you blame for this post office scandal, Heather?
It goes back to the original software, and I was incredibly lucky. As an MP, I didn't have a single postmaster or mistress in my patch get caught up in it. But one of the gentlemen who was going to be retiring sat me down for an hour and a half and told me how the whole process had gone wrong, which was a shock. And I'm going back now 12 years or so. And so basically there was a glitch. If you had more than one unit open at a time, one unit would be talking to the machine, but the other unit wouldn't.
So you blame Fujitsu for the system?
It's definitely the software package, absolutely.
Right. And so should people be going after, prosecutors be going after Fujitsu?
My understanding with them is that they have suggested that they handed a process over to the post office. The post office never came back and told them there were glitches. So that's their get-out-of-jail card.
Who do you blame, Catherine?
So I think it is, first of all, absolutely horrifying, the personal testimonies of what people have been through and what they've been subjected to. And obviously there is an IT error here, and there's an issue there with the contract and what happens with that government relationship with Fujitsu, and I think that's right to be examined. But I think fundamentally we've known about this problem
for a long time.
And here we are, finally it getting the attention from government that it should, to start putting it right and fast-tracking this process. But we've seen these poor postmasters trying to fight a system, a justice system, against, very well-funded lawyers who are fighting at every turn. And I think it's right that that is now fast-tracked, and thank goodness the government are focusing on it. But I think it's important that we have this independent inquiry to look at the full picture of what has happened here. Because I also think it shouldn't distract from that fight for justice, which is still ongoing. And I think it's a risk that we move on to pointing the blame and actually don't focus on delivering that justice, which is still outstanding for far too many people. And people are literally dying, waiting for justice and waiting for compensation as well.
Who do you blame, Richard?
I think there's varying degrees of culpability. Clearly, the problem started with a computer system that wasn't fit for purpose. But when the details began to emerge of how the discrepancies were arising, I think you can then start to blame Post Office management for failing to pick up on the multiple signals that we're getting and the way, the vindictive, there's no other word for it, the vindictive way that they, with their independent prosecutorial powers, then went after individuals and gaslit them by saying that this only affects you, nobody else is affected. And, the victims have spoken of the cathartic effect almost of finding out how many other people were in similar situations.
Well, because it seems as if they lied, basically,
well,
saying they were the only one.
They lied and they tried to isolate them, and I can only imagine the psychological damage that did to people. But I think also government ministers cannot be let off the hook on this, because we now know that whistleblowers were speaking to Ed Davey, a minister in the Lib Dem Conservative coalition government at the time, who brushed them off rather brusquely from the correspondence that we've seen.
I mean, they're not here, but the Liberal Democrats, but he says he was lied to by the Post Office, and there were other ministers. I mean, there were minister after
that
minister.
May well be the case. I wouldn't want to isolate Mr Davey entirely on this, but nevertheless, it is a job of ministers when they are getting those kinds of signals to interrogate the information they're getting. So I think there's varying degrees of culpability here, but what can't be in dispute is, in the pursuit of justice, there are people who need compensation and need it now to compensate for the impact this has had in their lives. And I really hope the government can fast-track that.
It looks as if there is some momentum. It's taken a television drama to do it, but it's definitely got more momentum than perhaps it has had in the past, despite other reports and programmes about this scandal. I mean, just briefly on Fujitsu, I mean, do you think there are other government contracts that they currently have, and they may be very difficult, even if the government wanted to disengage from? But, I mean, should they be given future government contracts? And then more broadly, what lessons can we learn from it?
So I think there's two things, and I think we have to separate out the justice element for sub-postmasters and mistresses and how they are going to be effectively treated and compensated. And there's this issue that we have in terms of government and its interaction with its officials. So if Ed Davey is saying that he was lied to, I think you have to also appreciate that government ministers have a lot of stuff that's coming at them. And if you're being told time and time again that there is no issue here, how can you not take that on trust when your officials or, the Post Office is saying that this is truth? Now, the wider point that I want to make is that that points to a difficult culture. And that talks about a culture where you're worried about blame, where you don't want to accept that something's wrong. It's a lack of curiosity. And how do we start to work on that culture that then is actually impacting? We don't know how many more situations at this current point in time. With Fujitsu, I think there are legitimate questions to ask around what they knew, how they dealt with it, and how they were sort of trying to ensure or give ministers or the Post Office assurance that their software wasn't at fault. And I think, they would have to, I mean, current procurement, we have to stay within the rules and guidelines, how you consider Fujitsu in its current capacity. Maybe people are going to be looking for more assurance of their software. But I do think that you have to start looking at how these systems are functioning and how you're holding your suppliers to account as well.
What do you say, Richard, in response to the idea that ministers, if they are told time and again one line or one version of events, it is quite difficult then to come out and say, no, you're wrong.
It is, and I think Salma makes a very fair point about the amount of things that are going across ministers' desks, but at the same time, it is also about the culture, and ministers are there to do more than simply accept the assurances. They're there to question, they're there to ask why, how, they're there to interrogate sometimes. And I think that there is I think there is a problem here in that ministers were being told, MPs were speaking up in the House of Commons about this, and yet it was all brushed away blithely as as, well, the post office say it's fine, therefore it must be fine. So I think Salma is right. There is a cultural issue there, and I think that ministers do need to take some share of the blame. I would be surprised if they don't.
I'd actually really like to give a hat tip to Paul Scully, the minister, because
he was here yesterday. He was sitting in your seat yesterday.
Well, I mean, it was under his watch that things changed.
But that wasn't until 2020, and this has been going on for decades.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. But at least he changed
Yes.
it. At least he got the public inquiry going.
But also the fact that, you know, backbench MPs were raising this on behalf of their constituents. So as maligned as MPs quite often are in the public domain, you know, James Arbuthnot stood up for his constituents and raised this time and time again. So there is a problem in the system where things like this are rejected, and the natural curiosity doesn't exist to say, is there an injustice?
Sorry, go on,
I was going to say, at times over the last 12 years, in my memory, since I was elected, it's felt almost like there's two parallel worlds. And just I recall last year a huge outcry about significant bonuses being allocated to post office management, and that being raised in Parliament, and huge concerns around that, because for most MPs, we know of people that have been affected by this scandal and couldn't believe that the post office was carrying on as if none of this had happened. And you've also got to worry whether it would just enough attention wasn't paid, because clearly there is going to be significant costs involved in putting this right. And the worry is that, you know, we need to put this right, and it shouldn't be a factor of of how that's paid for. I think justice needs to be done, and that has to be the priority. Right. And it just feels like it hasn't been listened to. And I do agree there is a cultural problem here that needs to be investigated, and that should happen as part of the independent investigation.
Well, we'll be following the story closely over the next few weeks and bring you any developments or updates, particularly from the Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk, on the issue of compensation and any convictions being overturned. Let's talk about school absenteeism. This week, both the government and Labour have outlined their plans to tackle the problem, because more than 1 in 5 children in England are persistently absent from school. Before the pandemic, it was around 1 in 10. Yesterday, the Education Secretary announced new attendance hubs and attendance mentors for persistently absent students and their families. Let me show you this headline from the BBC about Labour's plan, proposing free breakfast clubs to tackle persistent school absence. Let's talk to a head teacher, Simon Kidwell. He's president of the National Association of Head Teachers and the head of a primary and nursery school in Cheshire. Simon, welcome to you. What is the situation in your school, and what's happened since the pandemic?
So in our school, historically, we had good attendance with low rates of persistently absent children. But since the pandemic, we've seen an increase in the number of children who are absent and the number of children who are persistently absent. So we've had to be relentlessly curious about the factors behind that, because parents have been really supportive of the school. They were very supportive during the pandemic. But when we were telling them during the pandemic and post-pandemic that they had to keep the children off because either they were close contact or because school was closed, they've listened to that advice and actually changing that mindset now back to everyday matters, and sending children to school when they're feeling slightly under the weather. It's really important that we go and re-educate the parents to get those attendance levels back up to where they were in 2019.
Right, so you feel it is a cultural shift amongst parents since the pandemic about the necessity every day to have their children go into school, whatever else is happening?
I think when we look at the evidence from the Children's Commissioner, that the post-pandemic hangover is part of the problem, but there's also the access to special educational needs and mental health support services. There's also cited as a factor for children who are persistently absent. And the third factor is around the home environment, and an increasing number of children are becoming young carers for adults within their family. So it's making sure you really get behind the individual cases, because this problem is far too complex to just go and have a broad brushstroke of saying it's parents' attitudes post-pandemic.
What about working from home? Has that also contributed to this increase in pupils staying away from school?
Anecdotally, I think possibly. I think where if a child's not feeling very well and a parent is working from home, it's easier for them to go and say, right, well, take the day off and let's see how you get on. Whereas the culture when parents were at the office was go in, and if you're not very well, the school will phone me. So I think we really do need to make sure that every day matters and that children attend school every day, and that's seen as a norm.
Right. What are you doing? You mentioned that you are reaching out to parents, trying to sort of change the messaging, if you like, since the pandemic about children coming into school. What can be done to turn this situation around?
So we are having some success. Our rates of persistent absence at our school are below the national average. We still need to do more. So it's about developing those relationships with those families. So we know the families who are persistently absent. So over the school holidays, I spoke to the head of school, and she was sending messages out to the parents. We also preempted families that may not turn up for school, because we returned to school last Wednesday, and the high school didn't return till this Monday. So we made sure that we had a communication drive to make sure that the parents knew that our children needs to be in, even though the high school weren't back. And we also did some text messages and some phone calls for parents and for children's families who were persistently absent. So it's really targeting those families and giving them the support they need. Then if they need support getting into school, or they need some help, we're there to help on the very first day back.
Simon, thank you very much. Stay with us if you can. Salma, listening to all of that, I mean, there are a variety of reasons, but it has gone up starkly since the pandemic. School under Simon Kidwell working very, very hard with all their various measures to get children back into school who have been routinely absent. What do you think? How much impact did that pandemic and the post-pandemic period have?
Well, it's undeniable that it's huge. I mean, we're talking about these huge cultural shifts. It's not just about school. It's not just about the lockdown and the pandemic. It's exactly as you just as described. People who are not going to the office think about the way that they do education differently. And what's really striking for me is that these kinds of questions haven't come up at the COVID inquiry, because it's about economic impact as well as health impact as well as educational impact, and it seems to have had this huge effect, and yet we haven't really discussed what we think was the impact of that lockdown.
Well, I mean, on that, your government closed schools. Maybe that was the wrong decision. Do you regret that schools were closed?
They were working on the information at the time, which is the only honest answer I can give you. I think people might consider not doing that now, but that's hindsight, isn't it? So I agree with Salma. I mean, I really want the inquiry to be looking at what happened, but then what do you do differently next time? Well, we're not really there yet,
no,
are we?
but should there have been more debate at the time? I mean, Labour arguably was... Was there enough debate about the impact on school children of closing schools? Was there enough thought about the consequences, the longer-term consequences that schools like Simon Kidwell's are now having? Those rates, they've doubled. It's quite incredible.
They have doubled in 5 years, and they're set to continue rising. And I think that's the big crisis that we're facing, and it's urgent to arrest this development.
But Labour wanted longer lockdowns for schools to close for longer.
As I was going to say in response to Salma's mention of the COVID inquiry, that it's interesting that Gavin Williamson, the Education Secretary during COVID, hasn't actually been featured in the COVID inquiry because he wasn't in the room when these decisions were being made. Education clearly wasn't a priority for the government in the decisions they were making. At the time, I think we are brushing over the fact that schools were struggling to stay open simply because there were such high levels of COVID, and the teachers themselves had COVID. This was pre-vaccine. So I think we need to be really honest about the realities of COVID, but also that this goes much deeper than COVID. This goes back to years of a removal of a safety support net for families that has then added to COVID, which was a huge challenge that we faced as a nation, and how underprepared we were for it, and how under-resilient children have been in response to it.
We're talking about 1 in 10 going to 1 in 5, right? And from what Simon's just said, we're talking about a different cohort of people. So this isn't just about people who are traditionally vulnerable and show persistent absence. This is about an extension within that cohort. And as we've just heard from a head teacher, there are lots of different reasons here. So we can, I think, safely assume that this one huge societal shock that we had in terms of a pandemic has had massive implications.
Yeah, which is why the government commissioned Sir Kevin Bell to undertake a report into how we recover well from COVID, recognising the impact of it. He undertook a significant inquiry, recommended a whole range of measures. It was presented to Rishi Sunak as the Chancellor, who said, sorry, this isn't the priority, we're not paying for this. And now we're seeing the consequences. All of this was foreseen and is now playing out. And the fact is, though, it's not just about where we went wrong, it's about what we do now. And obviously Labour has set out a whole plan today of how we tackle this and really support families, support young people.
Which one of your
bring in mental health
proposals, or which
support
one of your
and breakfast
proposals
clubs.
will markedly change the dial on school absenteeism?
Well, I think as a combination, the measures will are intended. I mean, Labour's mission is to break down the barriers to opportunity.
And yet,
the way you do that through education. If the children aren't in education, you can't have a society
well,
that thrives.
Let me talk.
We will provide mental health support to young people.
Well, we'll come on to the mental health support, because that's clearly a massive issue, as Simon brought up. Well, I don't know how breakfast clubs necessarily would change the absenteeism, but let's have a think about it. But let's talk about the situation in Scottish schools, because the Scottish Government doesn't release data on persistent absenteeism, which is a shame, only the overall attendance figure. But research from the Reform Scotland think tank found via FOI requests that almost a third of students are persistently absent from school. So it's a problem there too. Do you just... It is with hindsight and it is with reflection, but do you think there was enough thought about the impact and the consequences lockdowns, multiple lockdowns, or rather closing schools, not lockdowns, sorry, closing schools would have on children?
I would like to think there is, but I think there's a danger of assuming that the choice was between lockdown or not, and that there was no consequences from not closing schools.
Yeah.
It was all about a balance of harm, because I can't think of anything more disruptive to a child's well-being than ending up with long COVID themselves, or having a parent do that, or end up with that, or worse.
But
so there's a balance of harm.
But I take your point about the balance.
OK, so in discussion with head teachers in my own patch, I know that children came back with multiple issues. Their development has been held back because of that. Again, that's part of the balance of harms that needed to be mitigated. And I know that schools across Scotland were open for key workers, and so it was important that was able to happen. So it's about how we deal with that in the aftermath.
Right, and what are you doing? What is the Scottish Government doing?
Well, the part of the increase in absence, it's not particularly persistent absence, but there has been an increase in authorised absence because of health. Now, perhaps, as Simon alluded to, some of that might be about a change in culture, that if somebody's not feeling 100%, if a child's not feeling 100%, the parent keeps it back.
So you have to change that attitude.
So, again, it's about working with that attitude and saying it's OK to come into school. If it is indeed OK to come into school, it won't be in all cases. There's an attitude with some parents as well that one of the biggest increases in unauthorised absences in Scotland has been parents taking children on holiday during term time. Again,
that was always the case pre-pandemic too. There were always instances.
It was,
of
but it's
that.
One of the biggest increases in this year's for Scotland. I'm sure it will be the same elsewhere in the UK. Okay. So again, there's a cultural issue to tackle there.
Well,
but in terms of the social economic aspects, in Scotland we have the Scottish Child Payment that's taken 50,000 children out of absolute poverty. That's helping to stabilise a lot of family backgrounds. And I think Simon is absolutely right. It's important to bore into the individual circumstances, because there may be caring responsibilities, there may be financial impacts there. Every story will be different, and it's about also making sure the information is there so that people know what is expected of them.
Let me go
and
back to Simon.
To meet those
Let me go
expectations.
back to Simon, because Simon, you're obviously taking all sorts of steps to try and tackle this at an individual level. Now, sitting here today as head teacher of your school, were you against, or are you against now, the idea of closing schools in a similar situation if another pandemic, God help us, happens again?
I think we can learn a lot from how we behaved in the last pandemic, and we didn't close schools, of course. We stayed open for key workers and vulnerable children.
Keeping them open more widely,
and we increased the attendance rates amongst them as well. But of course, as soon as we knew that COVID didn't have a huge impact on children's health, then we had far more opportunities to look creatively about what we could do. So, but it was, at the time we didn't know that children in the first few months couldn't get very poorly.
Right. Just talking about some of the other measures, in terms of Richard mentioning parents taking children out of school for holiday reasons, which has always been the case, there's always been a percentage. Should the fine for parents who fail to send their children to school without a good reason, it's £60 at the moment, should that increase?
I don't think it needs to increase, but it needs to be enforced.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Simon. I was looking at Catherine. You can't see. Catherine.
Oh, sorry.
Well, or Heather.
Heather.
It's all right.
Me getting
how's your COVID going?
It's been a while since I've had it.
I've dodged it so far. Goodness
You're lucky.
knows.
Well, you haven't tested positive. That's what
I tested every week.
Oh, really?
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway,
but
putting that aside.
If the head teacher has something to say, that'd be great. But I don't think it needs to increase. It does need to be enforced.
Right.
And I think we need to get back to those norms that you do not take your kids out of school for holidays.
Right, Simon, does it need to be increased?
Well, at the moment, the amount of term time holidays is the same as 2019, so it's not the significant driver for this increase in persistent absenteeism or for attendance overall. I think the problem we have, though, is when parents take children out for multiple holidays and they just bake the fine into the cost of the holidays. So I think that's where we should look at maybe looking at the sanctions we have available if children have 3 or 4 holidays a year.
Right. Well,
So financial crisis, what financial crisis? 4 holidays a year.
Right. I know. Do you not have 4 holidays a year? Catherine, what do you think? Should the fine go up?
Well, I mean, I think that it's important that the fines are in place. It's important that the message is clear to parents that it's not okay. This is something that we discourage, and every day at school matters. And I think that message is really important. But I think it's not going to solve the problem. And I do think it's much more fundamental and systemic, which is why Labour wants to put in, a really holistic approach to this and really reset that relationship between schools and families. And government has a role to play in setting that tone and putting the right supports in place, because it's about rights and responsibilities. And when you join a school community, it doesn't just affect your child when you take them out of school, it affects the whole community. It affects the teachers that have to then try and catch up those children. It affects the children that are in school when you're not. And yes, illness, of course, is a reality, and there will always be that to deal with. But to add to that in any way voluntarily has to be discouraged, because we have to rebuild that sense of community and belonging in schools so that children want to go to school, they want to be part of that community. We need to look at the curriculum to make sure it's got good standards, but it's also enriching and fun and bring back some joy to school.
Are you the Shadow Schools Minister?
Yes, I am.
Simon Kidwell, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to talk about tax, something completely different but equally important, because in December the Scottish Government decided to increase the higher rate of tax from 47, or highest rate of tax from 47 to 48%, and introduced a new tax bracket at 45 pence in the pound for those earning above 75,000 and up to just over 125,000 pounds a year. Let's hear from Scotland's Deputy First Minister, Shona Robertson.
When public services need investment and protection from Tory cuts, this government does believe that those with the broadest shoulders should pay a higher rate of tax. And to be clear, by the broadest shoulders, I mean the top earning taxpayers. We will therefore add a new income tax band to the Scottish system, the advanced rate, which will be set at 45 pence and will apply on incomes between 75,000 and 125,140. In addition, I'll also increase the top rate by 1 pence to 48 pence in 2024-25.
Why is the SNP raising those taxes for the highest earners?
Simply because we believe that those with the broadest shoulders should pay more. Now, we're under financial pressure in the Scottish Government because of the funding settlement that comes out of the UK Government. Now, Scottish taxes cover a certain portion of expenditure, but there's also the taxes we pay at UK level that then come back through the Barnett formula decided by spending decisions that are taken in England. Now, there's real pressures on our budget. There's a 10% real terms cut in our capital budget over the next 5 years, which will affect our ability to drive both public sector and private sector investment and to replenish schools and build roads and things like that. So in that kind of environment, we think it's fair that where we need the kind of social settlement in place, as Catherine was talking about earlier, for a whole range of positive outcomes, that when that extra resource is needed, that the burden falls on those with the broadest shoulders who are best able to bear it.
I mean, there'll be many viewers, Heather, who will agree with that, that if you earn a lot of money, why shouldn't you, the ones with the broadest shoulders, as Shona Robertson said, pay more tax to fund struggling public services?
And of course, the answer is they already are. They're already paying.
Well, that is true. They're paying record amounts of tax, and they have unsatisfactory public services, the worst of both worlds in England.
Well, that's an interesting viewpoint from the BBC, but thank you.
I think it's what people would say.
The top and bottom of it is, I think we all pay far too much tax.
Right.
And I think that we ought to be looking at reducing the levels of taxation. And I do not agree that it's appropriate for the Scottish Government to put those tax levels in. Of course, it's in their political settlement that they can do that. It's legitimate, you know, it is a tool that they can use. But I mean, one of the things that we've got, when we send armed forces personnel there, the government picks up the extra taxation that the Scottish Government levels on there, because obviously it's not a Scottish choice whether he goes to work in Scotland.
Well, a Scottie would pay less tax in Scotland because over half of Scots, or people paying tax in Scotland, pay lower levels of income tax than they would elsewhere in the UK.
So you're going to give the money back to the British government, are you?
No, I mean, that's a political choice that the UK government's choosing
Well,
to make. But I'm not worried. A Scottie will pay less tax.
Sure
a brigadier might pay. A brigadier might pay more.
Some money back.
That's not what I said. But that's a political choice that you're making. But Scotties would pay less tax in Scotland thanks to the SNP
All right, well, it's
government.
an interesting example, but let's just think more broadly, because Keir Starmer thought it was a good idea when he stood for leader in that election. One of his pledges in his campaign was to increase income tax for the top 5% of earners. Now, he's since abandoned that pledge. But as a principle, was he right?
So I think we have seen the consequences of a lack of economic growth, which I think has brought us to having the highest tax burden since the Second World War, 25 tax rises under this government. And we do have an incredibly high tax burden. And I think the responsibility of government is to ensure, yes, that is distributed fairly, but also that we grow the economy so that we can pay for our public services. And I don't believe it's the view of the BBC.
Without growth,
I believe it's the view of the public.
No, but without
we
growth,
are paying more and more tax, and we are getting
but Catherine,
less
the
for
reality
it,
is we
and
haven't
that's
really had
difficult.
economic growth. Now, admittedly, you haven't been in power or in government, and I accept that. But on the sort of track record of the last 10 years or so, broadly speaking, there hasn't exactly been stratospheric growth in the economy. So let's just say it's quite ambitious to think that a Labour government, when it comes in, will have those high levels of growth. Without that, and with more demand, it's not the BBC's view, Heather, but more demand on public services, and with them under continuing strain, can you really say that you shouldn't put up taxes on the people who earn the most?
So Labour's been really clear about the tax choices that we would make. I absolutely dispute what you say about it being ambitious to want to grow the economy. I fundamentally disagree with that. I think it has to be our number one priority as an incoming government. And we've seen the strategy that the previous government has pursued that has resulted in very low growth and also the highest tax burden. And we know that people are still paying the consequences of the Truss Kwarteng budget, which puts everyone's mortgages up. We're all paying the price of that, anyone with a mortgage. And so we will not make unfunded promises and unfunded pledges. And we've been very clear about the choices we would make. And I'll give you some examples of where we would make fairer choices in terms of tax. We will remove the tax exemptions for private schools, the VAT and the business rates.
I mean, that's fine as a direction of travel, but it is tinkering around the edges when you're talking about the amount of money that might be needed.
Can I just contest you saying that it will pay for 6,500 more teachers? We've just discussed school absence. Children are being taught by a non-science, non-maths teacher at high school. It will pay for those teachers and it will help deal with some of the challenges that we see in our public services.
Go as far as the SNP government, then.
We will also tackle the non-dom tax status. People very rich people that live in this country.
How much does that raise?
And don't pay their fair share. It will pay for mental health support,
it raises about 1.7 billion,
which will help tackle the problem of absence from school.
But Richard, is actually what Labour is saying a sensible path?
We need to
no one knows that the money
services.
that you are going to raise is going to be spent sensibly. Labour in Scotland, and yes, they would say this, will say it's your mismanagement of public finances that have meant latterly you've decided to raise taxes that you could have done at any point, but you've chosen to do it now, rightly or wrongly. Why should people in those higher tax brackets pay even more tax to fund public services that you haven't run very well.
Well, I would dispute that entirely.
Well, I know you would dispute it.
So,
I'm saying that's what Labour have said.
Well, it might be what Labour say, but I think the question for Labour is what are their plans? What would they invest? How would they invest? They're stuck with the same financial strictures under devolution in Scotland as the SNP Green government is. So, you know, are they in favour of higher taxes or not? I think we should be told. But I think more fundamentally for Labour at a UK level, you know, their one big idea was £28 billion to be invested in renewables. You know, that seems to be getting watered down by the day as the Tory culture wars put the frighteners on Keir Starmer as he's worried about, you know, his potential majority being frittered away. So, you know, I'd be interested to know, you know, is that £28 billion a cast iron commitment? What's the timescale? And also, how are we going to deliver that much fabled economic growth when we're driving with the handbrake on by being outside the single market and the customs union of the European
let's leave
Union?
the second part just for the moment.
Because Labour will leave us on the outside and in the cold.
Well, no, leave the Brexit, but the first bit.
So we will send out, we will set out very clearly our tax and spending.
No, on the
plans
28
closer to
billion, on the investment, on the
election.
£28 billion a year in climate change. Richard's question is, where it's now gone to the second half of a parliament if Labour wins the election, and now there's some doubt over whether it'll be £28 billion.
So that's to invest to grow, and that's
it's going to happen, is it?
Point that we're making, to invest in the economy to grow it. We believe that climate change is one of the biggest challenges facing us. We also know energy bills are one of the biggest challenges households are facing and holding them back. And we want to invest to grow. I mean, we need to look at the detailed plans of what that investment will be, how it will be funded, and how much will be needed in the initial term of government. And clearly, we need to know what the financial circumstances are that we inherit, because they're increasingly challenging, and everybody knows that, and everyone feels it.
And this is why more and more people in Scotland think that we should be in charge of these decisions for ourselves, of course.
Well, when you say more and more people, that's a very vague thing on numbers. What do you mean, more and more people?
That's why, you know, there's around 50% of Scots want to be independent, so precisely so we can be in charge of those
at all,
decisions.
has it, Richard, over the years? Salma, tax. It looks like the economy is beginning to come back as the, you know, certainly up there at the top. Issue, which it always is, I suppose, at elections. Let me just show you this graph. Tax as a percentage of GDP. I mean, Heather, it's the highest ever on record, predicted 2028 to 29, 37.7%. I mean, is there evidence, which is a bit unfair to ask you, but I mean, is there evidence that people want, in those high roads, want to pay and would pay more than that in tax, overall tax burden, to fund public services?
I think you've got to ask the question as to whether people think that they are getting a good deal as far as public services are concerned, and whether putting more money into public services is actually the right thing to do. I think one of the theories behind tax cuts at this present moment in time is because people are facing really sharp cost of living issues with inflation. So being able to cut taxes and put money back into people's pockets seems like a sensible thing to do. It's a very classic Conservative thing to do. I think the dynamic between public services and taxation is, can you do it better with less? And Labour is also talking about sort of this reform idea, because you're right to point out that growth is not this thing that's going to be delivered magically or easily. And so that challenge of suggesting that growth is the thing that's going to give us more tax receipts, I don't think that's a real stable sort of position to take on your economic policy. But certainly that question around what public services are we getting and how well do they deliver? And actually, can you take not just efficiencies, but reform more seriously? I mean, like, even that's only going to give you a little bit sort of, you know, of savings when it comes down to it. But are you getting what you pay for? Is the question. And I don't think people feel that they are at the moment.
We haven't got much time, so we're going to talk... well, yeah, but really briefly, because we've got to talk about flooding.
I would agree. Public services need reformed. How we spent the current budget needs to be looked at, but we do need to focus on growing the economy and creating a more stable economic and political situation for this country. Will bring that growth.
With respect, though, yeah, anybody can say that. You know, this government says
this government hasn't delivered it.
This government says
the Labour government will.
But this government did deliver growth against a backdrop of austerity and won a small majority in 2015. So this idea that this is like one long thing over 10 years is a misapprehension. So saying that you're going to deliver growth, yes, nobody's going to argue against that. How you're going to deliver it, which is actually Richard's question around the 28 billion on green investment, is one of the things that people are really going to start looking at. I'm interested to know, where is this growth going to come from?
All right. And that's for another programme. We're going to talk about flooding and your constituency. The Guardian, government response to flooding was to stare out of the window. Watching the rain come down is the picture beside it, says Labour. Now, flooding has caused pretty serious disruption, hasn't it, in the East Midlands region, including your constituency of South Derbyshire. Tell us about it.
Yeah, we've had more water than we've ever had before, 30 inches of rain, 30 hours of rain. In one go, and I've had village after village cut off, and as long as you didn't actually have to leave your village, you were absolutely fine. Buses couldn't get through, cars floating away, all that sort of stuff. In my northern part of the constituency, there's been a huge investment in flood defences for Derby City. It's saved on paper 2,500 properties in Derby City, which is fantastic. But the risk for us is it's now funneled that water even faster down to us. So we're getting statistics on about 4 key areas in the constituency from the Environment Agency. But the Environment Agency have actually offered to have 2 public meetings, which is really good because they've never done that before in my patch.
Right, but
so
are you disappointed about the lack of funds more broadly that have gone into flood defences? Because the government's committed to spend £5.2 billion, which is a lot of money, on flood and coastal erosion programmes between 21 and 2027. Now, we looked at the figures, or the National Audit Office gave us the figures, and it looks as if there has been an underspend of £310 million in those first 2 years. That must be infuriating for you.
It's infuriating how long things take to happen. That's what's infuriating. It took 5 years to get the Derby scheme going. They still haven't finished building it, which is really infuriating. But, I mean, I'm hopeful that EA money, the Environment Agency money, will be kept and the Treasury won't claw it back, because it's clear that we need more schemes, but we need to find a better way of getting them built.
Right. Has the government really taken this issue seriously? Because unless you are, I mean, there are more constituencies suffering as a result, but unless you've experienced it sort of firsthand, do you think there really is a serious enough approach to the damage?
I mean, 2 things. I mean, you know, I can give you another example. So one of my other villages, Hatton, had a massive flood defence scheme, but it was part paid for by the Nestle factory that's there, because it was in the Nestle factory's interest. So it was a partnership between the private sector and the public sector. And that saved over 110 properties being flooded. And, of course, it saved the factory being flooded, which was really important. You know, it's hundreds of jobs there. But what I would like to see is we will get these public meetings with the Environment Agency. We will get the statistics. And it can't just be that this 30 hours is a one-off, because if it is, then we'll have to wait and see, won't we?
Well, but there are areas that are having this time and time again. It isn't one. I mean, just to show you, this has just been confirmed by the European Union, their climate committee service. BBC News 2023 confirmed as world's hottest year on record.
As we had snow in London yesterday.
Well, but still, those figures stand. Keir Starmer said yesterday Labour would provide more money for flood prevention. Well, £5.2 billion has been committed till 2027. How much more is Labour going to commit?
I think one of the key things that Labour would like to see established is a task force, flood resilience task force, to then keep on an annual basis collaborating between local authorities, between government, to be at the forefront of ensuring we have serious plans in place to prevent floods and to spend that money to make sure it is spent wisely and where it needs to be spent.
Right, so not more money then? Or the task force, yes, but if he's committed to spending more money, do you know how much more?
No, I don't know how much may be committed to this, but I do know that this current government is not committed to tackling climate change, and I think this is going to become increasingly an issue, and that's something that Labour is committed to.
Well, Heather, respond. I mean, I know you say we had snow, but that's because climate change causes wetter winters as well, doesn't it?
Wetter winters. I think what we've got, and everybody accepts now, there are climate differences, without a doubt, and also I think people accept that we seem to have more extremes.
Right. Well, we know this government's not committed, and there have been numerous resignations and unhappiness on the back of it. Yeah. They're focused on oil and gas licences when they're not going to reduce bills and they're not going to increase our energy security or tackle climate change.
That will
it needs to be a priority. It will be for the Labour government.
All of that is in order to have security. We do not want to be beholden to Russian gas and electricity.
And on that note, it's all we have time for. But thank you to all of my guests. But you can continue chatting. There is no problem. I'll be back tomorrow at 11:15 for Prime Minister's Questions, the first one of the year. Join me.
The Dragons are back.
Behind those doors,